Somewhere in eastern Ukraine, a machine the size of an apartment building stands frozen in a lake it made itself. It weighs over 4,000 tons, built to move more earth in a day than an army could move in a year. The Soviet Union built machines like this by the hundreds to dig coal, phosphate, copper, and diamonds because its future depended on outrunning nature. Some of them are still working. Most are not. One of them didn't just stop. It made a Nobel Prize-winning writer's name famous. This is what's left of the machines built to move mountains. Start near the town of Aleksandria in central Ukraine. There's a flooded pit here that looks post-apocalyptic, and the only way to reach its centerpiece is by boat. Rising out of the water is a rotary excavator called the ER-Ashard 5250, a 16-bucket machine over 30 meters tall, weighing more than 4,000 tons, with a conveyor arm stretching nearly 200 meters. Nearby sits a second machine, a German-built Tackraft ER's 1120, just as massive. Both were part of the same operation. The ER-SHRD 5250 was switched on in 1987, one of the newest mines in the entire Soviet coal system, built to strip lignite for regional power at industrial scale. In its best years, it helped pull more than 1 million tons of coal annually out of the ground. It ran for barely 23 years. The mine didn't close because the coal ran out. It closed around 2009 to 2010, officially over unpaid electricity debts that had piled up faster than the company could clear them. Nobody formally decommissioned the site. Workers simply stopped, and the machines were left exactly where they last operated. Groundwater did the rest, slowly flooding the pit until the excavators were standing in their own private lake. Today, the only regular visitors are urban explorers who reach the machines by boat and climb the rusting hulls, and scrap crews slowly stripping what they can still reach. Locals say what's left will eventually be cut apart and sold as metal. This wasn't an isolated failure either. The surrounding Aleksandria coal complex once ran an entire fleet of these giants across neighboring pits, feeding the same regional grid. When the money ran out, it didn't take down one excavator. It took down the whole operation at once, leaving multiple machines of this scale stranded in the same stretch of flooded ground. A machine engineered to run for 100 years failed for the most unglamorous reason imaginable. Not geology, not war, not disaster. An unpaid bill. That machine failed because the money stopped. The next one failed because it was fighting a landscape that never really lets go. And in some ways, it's still fighting it today. 90 kilometers from Moscow, there's a stretch of ground that doesn't look like Russia at all. Sand ridges in white, black, and reddish tones rise out of flooded trenches. Pine forests are seeding themselves in straight rows across former industrial ground, and scattered through it all are rusting machines nicknamed absetzers, spreaders, built to move overburden out of the way, now sitting half-buried like beached ships in the dunes. This was the Lopatinsky phosphate mine, once the largest phosphate operation in Europe, run with its own dedicated internal railway and a full fleet of specialized excavators to feed Soviet fertilizer production on a scale meant to modernize agriculture across the entire Union. It closed in 1993, as the economy that funded it collapsed almost overnight. And just like the mine in Ukraine, nobody hauled the equipment out. It was simply left in place. The pits flooded, the dunes formed, and what was built to extract a resource meant to make Soviet soil more productive has become, decades later, a landscape people travel to hike through, precisely because it looks like nowhere else on Earth. Sand dunes and pine trees growing where rotary excavators once stripped the ground bare. One mine failed because the state funding it disappeared. The next site never stopped at all, because it was never just an economic project. It was a labor camp with a coal seam underneath it, and the machines built to work it. Outlasted the system that built them, still turning long after everything else around them had already changed. In northeastern Kazakhstan, there's a coal pit so large it swallows the horizon, worked by a machine locals call the big wheel of Ekibastuz, a bucket wheel excavator still cutting coal alongside dozens of other Soviet-built diggers and haulers. Unlike almost everything else on this list, it never stopped. This is Ekibastuz. According to local legend, framed here as legend and nothing more, a shepherd first discovered the coal by accident. noticing that the black rocks he'd propped his cooking pot on had caught fire. Whatever the origin, coal was formally identified here in the 1870s, but large-scale mining didn't begin until a railway finally reached the area in the 1950s. By the 1970s, Ekibastuz was the third largest coal mining center in the entire Soviet Union, engineered to send electricity to the Urals and European Russia through a chain of massive thermal power stations. But before it was an industrial marvel, it was something darker. Ekibastuz was also a place of exile, a labor camp in the Soviet Gulag system. Its most famous prisoner was Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, sent here after falling from favor in Stalin's USSR for his writing. He was later expelled from the country and awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, largely for exposing that same camp system in the Gulag archipelago. The pit outlived the ideology that built it. It's still operating today, still producing roughly 2/3 of Kazakhstan's coal and generating around half the country's electricity from it. Soviet-designed machines are still doing Soviet-scale work here, decades after the empire that ordered them built came apart. This isn't a ruin. It's a living fossil, a system that kept moving long after the reason it existed had already been rewritten by history. The machine that never stopped working sits on ground where the people who built the system around it were sent as punishment. That pit is still moving. The next one stopped moving people entirely, into a hole so deep that reports claim it can pull helicopters out of the sky. In eastern Siberia, near the town of Merny, there's a diamond mine that drops 525 meters into the earth and stretches 1,200 meters across, with a spiral road cut into its walls like the thread of a screw. Reports have claimed the airspace above the pit is restricted because of downward air currents strong enough to affect low-flying helicopters. That claim remains disputed and unconfirmed, but persistent enough that the airspace restriction itself is real and still in place. Development began in 1957, and the conditions were brutal, even by Soviet standards. Winters lasted 7 months. Summers turned the permafrost to mud, thick enough to swallow machinery. Equipment had to be covered every single night just to keep the oil from freezing solid and the steel from shattering in the cold. And yet, by the 1960s, Mir was producing so many diamonds, around 2 million carats a year at its peak, that De Beers, the global diamond cartel, couldn't explain the volume. The pit looked too small to be producing what it was producing. In 1976, De Beers finally negotiated a site visit. By the time their delegation actually reached the mine, their visas were about to expire. They got 20 minutes inside. Open pit mining ended in 2004. The official explanation was that the pit had become too deep and unstable to continue safely. Other, less substantiated theories have circulated for years, but the depth explanation remains the one backed by the evidence. Underground mining began beneath the old crater in 2009, directly below the abandoned open pit that had made the mine famous in the first place. In 2017, that decision came back with consequences. Water broke from the old, flooded, disused crater into the new underground shafts beneath it, trapping workers far underground in a real and documented disaster. Several miners lost their lives. It wasn't fate, and it wasn't a legend. It was one mine's old wound reopening beneath the mine built to replace it. An entire city, also named Mirny, was built right on the edge of this pit specifically to run it, home now to roughly 35,000 people. For decades, haul trucks the size of small houses spiraled down that thin dirt road into the pit, a round trip that could take up to 2 hours each way. The mine that swallowed a fortune in diamonds also, quite literally, built the only reason that town exists. That mine's aftermath turned deadly underground. The next site never had to go underground to become dangerous. It's still open to the sky, and it's on fire. In the Chelyabinsk region of Russia sits Korkino, a hole in the ground so deep it's visible from orbit, among the deepest open-pit coal mines in Russia, and by some measures in the world, though the exact ranking is debated depending on how it's calculated. People have walked down into it on a wooden staircase built into the pit wall. Electric trains still carry workers and coal along a spiral track winding toward the bottom. The mine was built to exploit one of the richest coal deposits in the Urals, expanding steadily over decades of Soviet industrial growth into the largest coal operation in the region. At its deepest, the pit runs roughly 500 meters down, a crater so vast that satellite images of it circulate online simply as a curiosity, long before anyone explains what it actually is or why it's still burning. But somewhere along the way, the coal seams beneath the pit started burning on their own. Spontaneous combustion, deep underground, in seams that can't simply be doused with water once they ignite. The fires have released carbon monoxide and heavy dust for years, drifting toward the town of Korkino itself, just 10 kilometers from the city of Chelyabinsk. Residents have described rising rates of illness in the area, though the exact causes remain disputed among officials and environmental groups. In recent years, operations have been winding down, with the mine moving, gradually and not without controversy, toward closure and environmental reclamation, while officials describe it as one of the most ecologically damaged sites in the country. Equipment that once worked the pit has been left behind as extraction shrinks around it, year by year. A hole dug to fuel homes and factories is now, quietly, burning underneath itself, in seams that have been smoldering for years with no realistic end date. Nobody has found a way to put it out. That pit turned toxic almost by accident. The last piece of this story isn't about an accident at all. It's about the one design decision that connects every machine on this list. None of these excavators moved on wheels, and most of them didn't move on tracks either. The largest Soviet excavators, the walking draglines, given names like ESH-1, ESH-1590, and ESH-2090, were built to physically walk. Instead of rolling, giant mechanical shoes lift the entire structure and shuffle it forward, a few feet at a time, letting a machine weighing thousands of tons cross raw, unbuilt step with no road beneath it at all. A single step might move the machine less than a meter. It didn't matter. Given enough time, a walking dragline could relocate itself across an entire mining district, one lumbering stride after another, without a single rail ever being laid down in front of it. The logic was simple and radical. Mining shouldn't have to wait for infrastructure. If there was no road to the coal seam, the machine would just walk there itself. Soviet engineers designed these excavators specifically to remove that dependency, and the design was taken seriously enough that American intelligence analyzed it directly, with the CIA producing its own technical assessment of the ESH-1 as a marker of Soviet industrial capability during the Cold War. But the same independence that made these machines revolutionary also made them a trap. They were single-purpose, expensive to build, and nearly impossible to repurpose once a pit was exhausted or the funding behind it vanished. A machine engineered to walk anywhere on Earth had, in practice, nowhere else to walk to. When a project ended, the walking excavator simply stopped, right where it stood, facing the seam it never finished cutting. That's the machine standing in that Ukrainian lake. That's the spreader half buried in Russian sand. That's the excavator still turning in Kazakhstan, and the dozens more sitting silent across the former Soviet Union, wherever the funding, the ideology, or the ground itself finally gave out. These pits and machines aren't just industrial junk left to rust. They're physical proof of a very specific belief, that with enough steel and enough state will, engineering could outplan geography itself, that any landscape, anywhere, could be made productive on command, permanently, regardless of what the ground underneath actually wanted to do. Some of that belief turned out to be right. Ekibastuz is still digging, decades later, exactly as planned. But most of it wasn't right at all. A diamond pit flooded the mine, built to replace it. A phosphate operation became a hiking trail. A coal seam is still quietly burning underneath the town. And what's left behind, across an entire former empire, is not concrete, and it's not ruins in the usual sense. It's iron, standing exactly where it was last useful, in pits too large to ever quietly fill back in. Back in that lake near Alexandria, the ERSHRD 5250 still sits in the exact position it held the day it stopped. Its conveyor arm angled toward the coal seam it never finished cutting. The future it was built for never really arrived, but the machine did, and it's still standing there.